In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to find the main argument for Chapter 3, Effort Counts Twice, in our Grit textbook. Now, finding this main argument will kind of be the foundation for your doing well on the reading questions and paragraph exercise this week. And you're also going to find that probably much of what I say this week is going to repeat what I said last week in that extended video of how to find the main argument in Chapter 1. But that's okay because learning to find these main arguments is kind of a cornerstone of our learning to read critically in this class. And it's also a key skill that we'll be using pretty much every week in the course. So I think it's okay to repeat things a bit. Now, what I want to say is just to remind you that a main argument is the overarching theory or belief that the author is trying to prove as true. Okay, so in the Grit textbook, Duckworth's main argument is passion plus perseverance for the long term, which refers 2 or more years, equals grit. Now, this is important to understand because for every chapter that we read, like for chapter 1, Duckworth made an argument that was supporting this main idea. And you guys figured out what that main argument was by kind of looking at the evidence and support and the stories in the chapter. And from that, you were able to think, okay, here's the main argument of this chapter. And indirectly, you were maybe starting to figure out the main idea of the overall book. Okay. All right. Now, let's review a little bit of how to find that main argument. So even though we might look at the stories and evidence in the chapter, those stories themselves are not the main argument. So you would never say, oh, the main argument of the chapter is that West Point cadets, have to work really hard. That's not, the examples are not part of the main argument. A main argument is kind of a generalized statement. So where would we find the main argument in Duckworth's chapter? One thing you can do is look at the beginning and end of the chapter for certain statements where she kind of is summarizing what the entire chapter is about. And also look for when the author describes her thought process or what she thinks about a story or example. And what I noticed a lot when reviewing chapter 3, pay attention to the author's questions. All right, she often asks some questions or states what questions she was having when writing or thinking through what grit is. And that gives you a big clue right there. Now, for yourself, here are 3 questions that you can keep in mind. What idea does the author keep repeating or going back to? What big picture idea are the example stories trying to show you? And what do these examples or stories prove is true? Now, to help you with this, we're going to kind of walk through and practice it together. That's a little different from last week. So, last week I walked you through each example in the story or in the chapter as it was and pointed out some of the key ideas that I thought were important. For this week in chapter 3, and I do want to make this one note, we are not reading chapter 2. No. We are skipping this chapter. And the main reason is just because she kind of repeats herself in both chapters. She makes pretty much the same case in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, and I just think chapter 3 is a little more relevant for us. So do not read chapter 2. You must read chapter 3 this week. Okay, so kind of going back, there are about 5 stories in chapter 3. All right, there's the swimmers, there's kind of Duckworth's time in school, grad school, and where she had to come up with a theory. There's Warren Mackenzie, the potter, John Irving, the writer, and then this interesting treadmill test at the very end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain how I'm seeing the lesson for these first 2 stories, okay, and how they're relating to the argument. And then you're going to explain what you think in these last 3 stories for your online class session. So let me explain how that'll work. So from our week 2 class session page, if you scroll all the way down to Friday, Sunday, and eventually this video I'm recording right now, you'll see right up here on the top. And you see that there are questions here. There's the Warren Mackenzie question. There's the John Irving question, the treadmill test question. Okay, you're going to answer these questions. And what these 2 questions is same for all of them. Give 2 quotes from one or 2 quotes from the section that state the main idea or takeaway from the story. So show me the sentences you read in the book that helped you identify the main takeaway for this Warren and Mackenzie story. And then your own words, state what the lesson or idea is that you got. Okay. And I'm going to walk you through how I'm doing that for the first 2 stories that she gives in the book, which are the swimmers and her school theory. And then you're going to do that for the remaining 3 in the online class session videos. So you will submit your answers to these questions by, going up at the top and clicking submit answers. So make sure and do that for all 3 questions, and then I'll review these other questions in a minute. Right now, I'm going to walk you through the sentences that helped me identify the main lesson and the main idea in specific stories that Duckworth told in Chapter 3. So right away, even before we get to a story, at the end of the first section, I came across this important sentence. Why does an unconscious bias toward talent persist? So remember how I said earlier, pay attention to the questions that Duckworth is asking, because this is going to clue us into what her argument is in the chapter and what she's trying to prove. Now, soon after that, she introduces swimmers. All right, basically competitive swimming. And there's this sentence where it says, the most dazzling human achievements are in fact the aggregate of countless individual elements, each of which is, in a sense, ordinary. So right now that might be cluing me into how we get to talent, or what talent is. Basically, it's a big achievement, but that's made up out of countless smaller elements. All right, and then I go over to the next page, and she gives kind of this statement, and quote, it is as if talent were some invisible substance behind the surface reality of performance, which fully distinguishes the best among our athletes. And these great athletes seem blessed with special gift, almost a thing inside of them, denied to the rest of us, perhaps physical, psychological, or whatever. So here she's kind of defining what she means by talent and how we tend to think of talent. And then she gives this statement. In other words, when we can't easily see how experience and training got someone to a level of excellence that is so clearly beyond the norm, we default to labeling that person as a natural, or in other words, like talented. So this is cluing me into what she's thinking about talent and kind of what she's arguing a little bit. She's sort of walking out why do we call some people talented and others not? All right, then on the next page we get to this sentence, all right? High-level performance is, in fact, an accretion of mundane acts. All right, so what she's meaning there is basically a high-level performance isn't maybe just some innate skill, but it's just performing a bunch of little mundane things perfectly. All right, then on the next page, we're really getting to some good sentences. So what she's pointing out here in this paragraph with Nietzsche, she says, we don't want to sit on the pool deck and watch, like Mark Spitz, progress from amateur to expert. We prefer our excellence fully formed, meaning we tend to maybe overlook talent when we see it developing, and we only recognize it when it's fully formed. All right, then here's a key quote. Mythologizing natural talent lets us off the hook and lets us relax into the status quo. So she's kind of saying, if we think that, that's just talented and it's something magical that I can't reach, we don't even try to reach it. And then lastly, for the swimmers, she kind of talks about craft. She says, do not talk about giftedness or inborn talents. One can name great men of all kinds who were very little gifted, but they acquired greatness because of genius. All right? And then she ends the quote. It's actually a quote by Nietzsche, pretty much talking about saying, they took more pleasure in making the little secondary things well than in the effect of the dazzling whole. All right, so what I took from all these sentences, now what I showed you here would be when I asked you in that question, give 1 or 2 quotes from the section to support the main lesson from the story, I would just pull 1 or 2 of all the ones that I just read to you that helped me figure out the main idea. Now for the second question, it's, in my own words, what's the main idea or lesson? I'm going to give that to you in a second. So, the main lesson that I think Duckworth is telling us in this swimmer story is basically that talent is really nothing more than a lot of practice. We often believe that talent is unachievable or magical because we don't see the amount of effort and work that goes into it. So, all those quotes and sentences that I showed you, I basically kind of took them all and in my mind synthesized them and summarized what I thought the main lesson was. So next, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through how I did that with the next story, which is Duckworth's theory. What I'm calling the author school story and theory story is when Duckworth was in grad school and she's going to kind of like her professor's office here, and then she's devastated when her professor asks or makes this statement: "You don't have a theory for the psychology of achievement." And this kind of prompts Duckworth to then kind of ask herself and realize, I hadn't worked out how exactly talent and effort and skill and achievement all fit together. And this is really a key statement for the whole chapter. So then she kind of gives us a little bit of a definition of what a theory is, and that's a bit important. But what I really want to focus on and what kind of is the main thing to learn from this section is this equation that she comes up with, which she basically states right here, which is talent is how quickly your skills improve when you invest effort. Achievement is what happens when you take your acquired skills and use them. And right there, that is pretty much the definition of this chapter. And the following stories that she gives, like on the potter and the writer and everything, are kind of illustrations of this sentence right here of how talent is basically how quickly their skills improved when they put in effort, and how they reach their achievement by making that effort. Now, I could say that the lesson I took away from Duckworth's theory is this: Duckworth believes that talent alone isn't enough to reach achievement. Effort is needed first to develop the skills, and then second to apply those skills. When this is done, mastery or achievement is reached. It's at this level that people usually say that a person is talented. So you notice how I'm sort of summarizing and putting into my own words some of what she said. And that's okay because I'm taking her ideas and I'm synthesizing them and I'm making them my own. Now, what I want you to do on your own is go through the rest of the chapter and do the exact same thing for the Warren McKenzie story, the John Irving story, and the treadmill test, and give the one or two quote sentences that stood out to you in this section and that helped you understand what is the main lesson or idea that Duckworth wants you to get from that story. And then once you've done that, go down and answer these two questions. Can you summarize all the lessons from these three stories, plus, maybe the story about the swimmers and how she came up with her theory? And can you put that into one idea? All right. And when you can do that, that's really going to help you with your reading questions, because let's go over to our reading questions from the syllabus. They're located on page 5. And they're right here on page 4. So in the reading questions, the first question you have, question A, what is Duckworth's main argument? You can basically take what you said right here for this question. Can you summarize all lessons one idea? And make that what you believe the argument of the chapter is. All right. And then for the second question, B, how does your answer for the above question relate to Duckworth's main argument of grit? What I'm wanting you to do and explain here is how, let me see if I go back to the slide, is how does what she says in this chapter right here with this evidence, how does this connect back here? How do you think that what she's saying about effort and talent, how does it relate to this equation of passion plus perseverance for the long term equals grit? So that's what I'm looking for you to answer. Now, to just review a little bit more on the reading questions that you'll do. For question B, basically, how did you determine this was the main argument of the chapter? What you can do is go back and, the quotes that you were giving for, in these questions right here for questions A, give 2 quotes for the section. You can just pull like one from each section essentially and say, this is how I figured out what the main idea of this chapter was. right? And then C is just a question of, do you agree or disagree with Duckworth's argument about effort and talent? Or do you have any questions? Were you confused by anything in the chapter? So one thing I want you to realize is that questions A, B, and C are going to be the same every single week. They do not change. Only the chapter we're reading will change. Now for question D, this is going to be a little bit different for this week. Instead of finding, parts of speech, you're going to apply what we learned in chapter 11, transitions, from our Oz textbook. And what I want you to do is read 3 pages here, pages 46 through 48. It's kind of the little bit on the treadmill test and Will Smith, and basically identify as many transitions, words, and phrases as you can. Now, to help you find those transition words, I've given you a resource. So if you scroll down here to number 3 and says additional resource, and then use list of transition words on this website, this is a very helpful source to use. You'll see, like under to add these transition words, will show you how to add an additional idea. So it just is helpful, even in your own writing, to go through and kind of look through these transition words. And hopefully doing this exercise will help you understand how those words are used in our everyday writing. All right, that's all I have to say about the reading questions and how to find the main argument for chapter 3, basically, how to find grit. So if you have any questions, please get in touch with me.